You are listening to the Political Periscope, a weekly podcast brought to you by Radio WNet. Interviews on international politics, security, geopolitics, economy, and more. Every Thursday at 7 p.m.
Today's guest of the Political Periscope is U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Robert Spalding, expert on China, author of the books Stealth War and War Without Rules.
Political Periscope.
Reading your book about this war without any borders, without any rules, without any limits, one can have this feeling, maybe impression, maybe wrong impression, that the conventional war is a thing of the past. But right now in Ukraine, we observe a conventional conflict with cannons, with tanks, with storming troops. So is it really a thing of the past?
No, I don't think war in the traditional sense is a thing of the past, unless you're talking about two opponents who have nuclear weapons. And then I think if we do have a war between two countries that have nuclear weapons, we risk catastrophic destruction of the planet and possibly humanity. And so I think this is what the PLA colonels recognize, that, China needed nuclear weapons. They needed to deter a nuclear attack on China, or they needed to deter a conventional attack by a nation like the United States. But if they had nuclear weapons, then it would probably not be, wise to have a war in the traditional sense with the United States or any other developed nation that had nuclear weapons. And therefore, in addition to that, globalization, the internet provided a number of opportunities that didn't exist prior to the internet and prior to the end of the Cold War.
So you think that the only conflicts, conventional, traditional conflicts, are possible between states that at least one of them doesn't possess nuclear weapons?
Right, yeah.
Regarding this, is Russia a real threat today for the United States, or it's just China?
Well, I think Russia has a nuclear arsenal that certainly would rival the United States, and in some cases is even more advanced than the U.S. is, because we've been lax in upgrading our technology when it comes to nuclear weapons. That being said, the conflict in Ukraine is between Ukraine and Russia, Russia having nuclear weapons, Ukraine not having nuclear weapons. And so I think what we're depending on is the restraint of the Russians, and that concerns me, particularly as we create a scenario where Putin feels embarrassed or cornered. I think that's the potential where we see that a nuclear weapon could be used. And so I think that when it comes to a war, in this case I would call it a proxy war. So Ukraine and Russia are fighting a proxy war for the second Cold War. I think we create, and we understood this during the first Cold War. We were very careful in terms of how we approach both the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War, in terms of creating the opportunity for nuclear weapons to be used either by China or Russia. In the case of the Korean War, I don't think the Chinese had nuclear weapons, and I can't remember the exact date that they detonated their first weapon, but certainly they had them during the Vietnam War. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we had rules of engagement with regard to the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And so I think that's the thing that we've lost sight of, I think, with the Ukraine war. And there is this feeling, I think, and I believe it's a dangerous feeling, that the Russians can be completely defeated in Ukraine without creating the risk for the use of nuclear weapons. And I think that's wrong. I think that's, probably the closest that we will come in the near term to the potential for a nuclear weapon to be used.
You said it's dangerous to beat Russian army, right, on the battlefield, but maybe there is another way to beat Russia, maybe using those techniques, this war without limits, the war described in your book.
Well, so here's the problem, at least as it pertains to Russia. We created sanctions against Russia, and then the Chinese have basically been providing them a means to escape those sanctions. China, Iran, North Korea. So Russia has, through China, the means to continue this war indefinitely. In fact, the Chinese just recently sent armored vehicles to Russia. So, and this is the really crazy thing about the war in Ukraine is that while we are supplying weapons and arms to Ukraine, and I support that, by continuing to allow China to be part of the global economy and get resources from the West, we are essentially now providing resources to both sides of the war. So in a sense, by allowing China to be part of globalization, we are prolonging the war because they have the ability to use that connection, that global connection, to support a sanctioned Russia.
Don't you fear that one ongoing war in Ukraine can spark other wars in the world, other conflicts such as between Iran and Afghanistan, or somewhere else in the Middle East, some in Africa, or even China attacking Taiwan?
Well, I don't know that it's the war in Ukraine that's sparking it so much as we have a definite bipolar world evolving where on one side you have China in the lead, you have Russia, Iran, and North Korea in the Belt and Road Initiative as proxy states for China. And so, yeah, we could see wars, start along the Belt and Road Initiative countries, with Russia and other states in Eastern Europe, with Korea, with Iran, with China, and the states that border its country. So, yeah, I think there's definitely potential for warfare, a traditional warfare, to break out at any time during this second Cold War, as we had during the first Cold War. I think the thing that people have really failed to grasp is that we are in a Cold War, and that a Cold War creates proxy wars on the periphery where the two main opponents are leery of coming into direct military conflict because of the potential danger for nuclear war.
Well, I maybe wasn't too precise. I meant that one ongoing war creates some ambience when the war is allowed. There is one war, so we have already a war, so why not starting another? But you answered basically my question. So do you think it may lead to the Third World War? Can we experience it in our lives?
Well, I think this is the risk that we faced during the first Cold War. And as opposed to now, back then, I think we had a much better appreciation for the destructive capability of nuclear weapons. We still were in the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We still had people that were very aware of how dangerous these weapons were and are. And I think what's different about today is that we are so far away from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that political leaders have lost their fear of nuclear weapons. And this is a thing that I think is terrifying to me. Not having a good dose of fear about the use of nuclear weapons and the potential for escalation if they start to be used, and where that escalation might end, I think this is the thing that we should be focused on right now. So, in many cases, I think the Chinese Communist Party came up with a way of war that doesn't risk nuclear warfare. But as you see, with this Cold War, conflicts like Ukraine and Russia can happen, And those can be the ways that nuclear war or World War III, to your point, becomes ignited.
How can we as democracies protect ourselves against authoritarian states such as Russia, such as China? We cannot control everything. One of the points, I think main points of your book is that our command structure is too scattered. It's not unified. We cannot coordinate effectively functioning of different services, the security services, army, etc. So can we even protect ourselves as democracies?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. One, do we want to preserve the free world? Do we want to preserve the principles and values of the free world? If we do, we have to isolate ourselves from the totalitarian regimes. We cannot have contact with them. We can't have media contact. We can't have financial contact. We can't have political contact within our societies, because they use those contacts to undermine the very fabric of our free societies. So that's number one. And we did that well during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We need to allow their systems to be isolated in order for the fact that their systems are not efficient at allocating resources and being productive unless they have access to the West. And that's number one. I think number two is, yes, we can defend free societies in that regard, and we showed it during the first Cold War, and that is to promise massive retaliation for any attack on an allied country. And I think that's the way that we have to begin to think about the world. We have to essentially separate clearly between totalitarian regimes and free societies, and allow the citizens of the free societies to thrive, to allow them to reach their true potential, have productivity, have freedom, and then allow the citizens of those countries that are in totalitarian states to witness the free world thriving and understand that their system is actually flawed and not conducive to providing for economic prosperity and the ability to live your true potential. And this has to go on for some period of time. We saw that during the first Cold War. It's not immediate. Unfortunately, what we have today, because China and the rest of the authoritarian regimes, except for like North Korea and now Russia and Iran, are plugged into the global trading system, the global financial system, the global political system. And they're slowly eroding the principles and values of free societies, both in the international system, like the UN, but also domestically in the political systems of our own societies. So, today, U.S. corporations and financial institutions, with their relationships with China, are slowly eroding the very fabric of American society in a way that's counterproductive for us maintaining our principles and values. So this will go on, and it has been going on for the last 3 decades. And I think it will go on until we begin to separate ourselves, our nations, from the totalitarian regimes. Don't allow them to have trade, financial, media, political, internet connections into our societies, and then allow our societies to begin to heal from these interferences and influences from these societies, and then provide a capability to thoroughly destroy our adversaries if they challenge us in a traditional military sense, and let that Cold War just continue and until there's a realization from the citizens that live in those regions of totalitarianism that is not the proper way to be, and then they begin the process of deconstructing. That's what happened during the first Cold War, and I think that can happen again during the second Cold War, but not until we have this clean separation.
It was a bit of a surprise for me that such interesting and important doctrine, Chinese doctrine, was made public. Should we make our doctrines, our strategies, our plans public because we are democracies, or should it rather be limited to some part of society, to government, or maybe some experts?
No, I think the real strength of our system is our ability to be transparent and to trust our citizens with the truth. And I think that's the difference between a free society. Certainly, our citizens can disagree, and they should have the ability to disagree with government. That's why, for instance, the United States Constitution, is organized the way it is. And I think the real change here, though, is the introduction of the internet. And I think in that case, data, particularly the personal data of citizens, needs to be secured. It needs to be encrypted. It needs to be the domain of the citizen themselves. And I think we've used this terror or this fright around terrorism as a means to justify having access to citizen data in a free society. That was never the intent. And I think as we move farther and farther into this technological era where data allows you to understand the perceptions, behaviors, intentions of citizens, and then we have both corporations and governments and financial organizations that seek to manipulate those perceptions, behaviors, and intentions. I think we create the type of future that sees the principles and values of democracy being eroded by that technological system. And clearly this is what the Chinese Communist Party saw, and this is what they wrote in that document, Unrestricted Warfare. But we were slow to come around. We believed that the internet was going to be a morally good technology for humanity. In reality, it's become exactly the opposite. But the reason it's become the opposite is because citizens have lost control of their privacy, which is through the use of their data. And so I think, what we fail to understand is the use of massive language models, big data, and artificial intelligence to begin to transform this mountain of data into usable information that then could be used to manipulate our population at the individual level. And so, technologically speaking, I believe that the internet ought to be secured. Your data ought to be encrypted. You should be the only one to have keys. If the government thinks that you are guilty of a crime, they can have their own, systems that are designed to listen to your calls, but they have to go through the same process that we used to have to go to before the internet. They have to get a warrant from a court. That process for getting a warrant, has to be clear to everybody involved, and then they have to go through the process of placing those bugs in locations based on that warrant, and then they have to build a case. But they can't just, on the basis of this system that exists, hit the rewind button and have total access to your life, because that is a recipe for totalitarianism.
But what about the strategies, security strategies? To what degree should they be made public? To what degree should they be hidden? So our enemies, the countries that endanger us, cannot see them.
Well, for the most part, our strategy with regard to the Soviet Union was fairly well known and well understood. I think there are some things that you want to keep secret, particularly some of the more, what I say, exotic ways that you might go about undermining a regime, using the tools of the state. But for the most part, I think we can be very transparent about what our strategy is, and that is a strategy of isolation, economic isolation, people-to-people isolation, basically a separation of the two groups to, allow the citizens of those other countries to understand that the regimes that they live under are basically there only to promote themselves. They're not there to promote the average citizen. And in fact, leveraging globalization to promote prosperity like the Chinese have done is a tactic of controlling the population. In other words, we trade you jobs for your political obedience, and the way that we give you jobs is by raiding or taking from the free societies because they think that, we're going to play by the rules.
What do you think about Joe Biden's policy, security policy, especially towards Russia and China? Do you think he can be influenced by some strange connections?
Well, I think he is already influenced. He's influenced because Washington, D.C. is influenced. For example, the companies and the organizations and the law firms are not primarily Chinese. They're primarily American or multinational. And essentially, they're lobbying on behalf of policies that the Chinese Communist Party wants because we've allowed them to create these financial, trade, economic, political connections. And, they have connections to our think tanks. They have connections to our PR firms and our law firms. They have connections to our corporations and financial institutions. And so when you look at any policy in the United States that comes forth in the Congress that's designed to protect us from Chinese influence, those get watered down by our own companies, our own people. So that's how unrestricted warfare works. It works through the people and the organizations of the country. It's not that you have Chinese that are influencing. Certainly that exists. But the vast majority comes from Americans and other, citizens of other free societies themselves, where they're trying to enrich themselves, which, is okay in a capitalist society. But in the way they're enriching themselves, that way has been influenced by the Chinese Communist Party to ensure the outcomes benefit the party. And so any protective measures like, stopping trade or stopping financial integration or any of these things that the Chinese Communist Party used to get jobs in China, it is, essentially comes under attack from our own companies.
Let's get back to the war in Ukraine. What is China's attitude towards this war, and what are current Chinese goals in this war?
Yes, very plain. They do not want Russia to lose. And so they want to make sure that Russia does not lose, and so they will support Russia to the extent that, Russia is successful in its goals. And I think if you were to look now at Russian goals after over a year of conflict, they've probably been moderated a bit. Rather than seeking the overthrow of the Ukrainian regime, they likely would be happy with some territory and maintaining that territory. And of course, Ukraine doesn't want this. And so this is the conundrum that we find ourselves in. Oh, by the way, it's the same conundrum we had during the Korean War, which was really the first proxy war of the first Cold War. And it evolved in much the same way. There was a lot of back and forth before we reached an armistice. And there's no peace yet on the Korean Peninsula. We are still in an enforced armistice, and so I think if we're going to avert the risk of nuclear war, then the way that gets averted is through some negotiated armistice, not a peace, not a recognition that any of Ukrainian territory belongs to Russia. Just a recognition that we're not going to kill people over it, until we can have a resolution that's more final. And that final resolution has to do with the eventual destruction of communism and totalitarianism in countries like Russia and China. Now, Russia, who knows? You may see the Putin regime fall, when he's gone, and then you may see, an opening of Russia. Who knows? We don't know how this ideological Cold War will play out. But certainly, as long as the Chinese Communist Party is involved, it will be instigating. Their goal is to get more and more countries to adopt their brand of political system. Not to become Chinese per se, but certainly to become authoritarian, where the citizens no longer dictate, the society that they have, but rather the society they have is dictated to citizens.
On one hand, you said that China doesn't want Russia to lose, but on the other hand, we see that weakening of Russia makes space for Chinese influence in Central Asia.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're going to see that just like the Soviet Union was kind of all-consuming of former Soviet states, I think China is going to exert more and more influence on the governing of its proxies. And I would call Russia today a proxy of China.
You think China allowed this war to happen?
Well, Putin went to China and had a meeting with Beijing prior to the invasion. I guarantee you that he told Xi Jinping he was going to invade. And this is the same thing, by the way, that Kim Jong-il did in the Korean War. He went to Moscow, he went to Beijing, and he said, I want to start this war. And they gave them the approval to go ahead. So I definitely believe that Putin asked permission from Xi and was given permission.
Is China going to attack Taiwan?
Yes.
So when?
I don't know, but I would say it very much depends on the U.S. presidential election and how China thinks that is going to turn out.
So if China attacks Taiwan, U.S. is going to intervene or not?
We can't. It could devolve into nuclear conflict, and so I think the role of the United States when it comes to an invasion of Taiwan would be to allow for the evacuation of those American citizens on Taiwan and those Taiwanese people that want to escape the rule of communist China. I think that's the way that we would intervene. And that would be a negotiated intervention where much in the same way that the U.S. intervened during the blockade of Berlin. So, we basically negotiated the ability to resupply the people of Berlin until eventually the Soviet Union relented. And so I think this would be, something very similar. Although I think in the case of China, it's hard to say, they have the ability to, within just a very few hours of totally dominating Taiwan. And I think it would be very difficult for us to do anything about that, even if we wanted to try. So we will have to figure out a way to work with China to allow for the evacuation of those people that want to be evacuated.
Polish famous expert on geopolitics, Jacek Bartosiak, often mentions his conversations with you. And are you familiar with his work, with his ideas, and what do you think about his ideas?
I can't say off the top of my head that I recognize the name, but I've had a number of conversations with organizations and people from Poland, and I think I think generally, if they are consistent with what I'm saying now, which has not changed at all from my position that I've had consistently with regard to China and Russia and totalitarianism versus democracy, then yes, I think it's it would be appropriate to say that I would agree with his views. I can't say right now that I recognize all his views.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This was the Political Periscope. The podcast is released every Thursday at 7 p.m.